excited to dive into this episode of Ecommerce on Tap, brought to you by Sourcify and ISBA. I'm your host, Nathan Resnick, joined by my co-host, Aaron Alpeter. Aaron, how's it going today?
Doing well, Nathan. How are you?
Amazing. Today we're covering By Humankind, which is a really unique personal care brand. But before we do so, Aaron, do you want to give us a quick overview of what Ecommerce on Tap is for those first-time listeners?
Yeah, we love telling stories. And so what we do is we take a well-known or very interesting company, tell their founding story, look at their supply chain, and then talk about their exit potential.
That's it. So before we dive in, what kind of tidbits caught your eye this week? I'm just curious if any came to mind.
Yeah, there was one that was kind of surprising, actually. And I've talked to a couple folks in industry, and I'm still trying to get this triple confirmed. But I saw a report where Customs is starting to inspect 100% of the air freight shipments coming from mainland China. And just for context, there are about 100 cargo planes each day that land in the U.S. And each one is about 100 tons of freight. So there's a lot of packages that are coming through. And this report talked about how a lot of these shipments were really e-commerce shipments that were Temu and Shein packages. And when they were landing at LAX, they were immediately being taken to a customs warehouse for a full inspection. And the interesting thing here is that CBP is finding a lot of really illegal stuff. They're finding fentanyl, they're finding drug making equipment, they're finding people who are misdeclaring what's on their shipments, so they can be under the de minimis threshold. So there's a lot of stuff. If this is true, this is a pretty big deal. And the impact is that it's having on airport congestion is not great. We're starting to see some indications that certain air carriers are canceling routes or pulling planes out of service. And this is really something that a lot of the big Chinese companies are worried. They're trying to figure out what's going on. So I think it's a good thing that Customs is starting to enforce the laws a little bit more. Because I think just from all the research that we've done and in the work that we do individually, it's very clear that this is a bit of a Wild West and doesn't need to be. But still, to kind of go from 0 to 100% inspection, if this is true, is quite the overreaction. That's a lot.
Yeah, that's crazy. That's a really interesting tidbit. I mean, we covered Temu on Ecommerce on Tap earlier last season, and it's such a interesting and great episode we did. I mean, I just wonder what their executive team's thinking about this when, now pretty much all their shipments are getting inspected, which I would assume would cause some delays. And I know, from our research, Temu already has, longer delivery times than, let's say, Amazon Prime, of course. But it's just interesting to see how that will impact their business.
Yeah. I don't think, if this does become a thing, I imagine what's going to happen is, and they're already starting to do this, is Temu and Shein are starting to set up warehouses in Mexico. Shein's actually looking at a U.S. network. And so what this will happen is all this stuff will go to Mexico, and then we'll be 3, 2, 1 in. And so it'll cause an issue for 4 or 5 months before they can get this infrastructure set up. But, commerce is like water. It's going to find the path of least resistance.
Yeah, I like that line. That's a good quote. What caught my eye is, we covered Liquid Death, and I'm actually drinking one right now. We covered Liquid Death on the Ecommerce on Tap episode, and it's just such an amazing and fascinating business. And so I saw someone post that they had said that in the spring of 2024, they were eyeing an IPO, but instead they recently raised a $70 million round at $1.4 billion, bringing their total funding to $270 million. So their growth has been insane, right? So from 2019, they do 3 million to, last year they do 260 million. And I'm just curious, do you think public markets will justify that 5x, revenue multiple for a sparkling water brand, or water brand, if you will?
Well, I think it really comes down to, are they profitable? Did you see anything about that? Have they turned things around?
I think they're heading in that direction. I don't quite know if they're profitable yet. So, we'll see if they file, for an IPO. And I've got to give a quick shout out for Fan B for bringing this to my attention on Twitter. He's a great follow for those that like to keep up with e-commerce news. He's at Life of By BI. So Thank you again, Fawn, for bringing that to my attention. But yeah, that's kind of what caught my eye this past week. Just kind of curious because we, spent so much time looking at liquid death on a previous episode. And, it's just interesting to see how like e-commerce companies perform in the public markets, right? It seems like a lot different than they do in the private markets in general, I would say.
It's a whole different ballgame, completely different set of rules, different set of criteria for success. Not everybody makes the transition. So I like Liquid Death. I hope they're able to get things sorted out. But I still think it'd be a great company to go public in a few years.
Definitely, definitely. So today we're talking about By Humankind. For those that are not familiar with By Humankind, it is a direct-to-consumer personal care brand focused on reducing single-use plastic waste. The company offers eco-friendly personal care products such as refillable deodorant, mouthwash tablets, and shampoo bars. So they really have a sustainable approach to all of their products, and that's what tries to set them apart. But I guess before we dive into their story and their business, let's kind of talk about, I guess, the history of sustainability. Do you want to guide us through what that looks like, Aaron?
Yeah, well, I think it's probably best to talk about my personal history with sustainability. But this has been something that has been around for a while. And it's changed over time. So I was lucky enough to work with Jeffrey Hollander at one of my companies. He was the founder of Seventh Generation, and learned a whole lot from him. And the interesting thing is when they were starting Seventh Generation, they were all about being, they had recycled toilet paper, they had biodegradable diapers and things like that. They were trying to kind of push the envelope a little bit. And it used to be where sustainability was their defining factor, was something that was a niche, right? And as things have changed and grown, lots of other mainstream people have adopted these sorts of things as well. And so, I remember having a conversation with him, and it was more of a, hey, we're not doing as well because these other brands are also doing biodegradable and sustainable stuff, and so we don't stick out as much. And so, what are we going to innovate on? What do we do differently? And it was just this really piece about, to some extent, the mission that they had gone out to do to make sustainability mainstream had been accomplished or was being accomplished, and they basically won, but that wasn't always a good thing for business. And so you start to see I think these waves in sustainability where there is something that people will kind of put a stake in the ground and say, this is what we're going to do. And they're successful in kind of educating people in the importance of recycled paper or deforestation or carbon, et cetera. And as they become more successful, more and more people, more and more companies start to mimic that. And so that piece that was unique and different about them is now table stakes, right? It's one of these things where, 100 years ago, people probably advertised that, like, hey, this house comes with electricity and indoor plumbing. And like those may have been luxury things that were great. But today, if you wouldn't even consider a house that didn't have indoor plumbing or electricity. You'd be like, what is this, right? I'm not living in a shed. And so really the story with By Humankind and kind of the evolution of sustainability is really an interesting one, where you have these companies, you have these people that are stepping out, making a stand, and showing that the consumers want to respond before larger CPG companies come in and kind of adopt that, right? Take that best practice, and it becomes more mainstream. And so it's this interesting balance between, are you changing the conversation in the ecosystem, or are you changing, do you have something that's good for a business? And so it's this interesting tension. But I'm just curious for you, do you have any personal history when it comes to sustainability? Or, is this something that's kind of been on your radar? Or, what's it look like for you?
Yeah, for me, when I think about sustainability and e-commerce, I think about this company called Byte, which was like, they became pretty popular pretty quickly because they went viral, I think through like a Shark Tank airing they did a while back. But they had like these, kind of chewable toothpaste tablets that you would just bite into. And, I bought those, and it was a great product. And, they really had a sustainable focus in terms of, they send you one jar when you buy of those tablets that, are your toothpaste, or replace your toothpaste. And then when you're subscribed, they just kind of send you those tablets. So they're not, having to use more and more packaging. And I think that's something that is always top of mind for me, because in our household, we probably buy too many packages off of Amazon, and our recycling bin is just full of Amazon boxes like most weeks, and it's kind of crazy when you're like pulling the recycling bin out to the curb, and you like look down your street, and like the whole neighborhood has like Amazon boxes. It's pretty
Yeah.
shocking, and I think it's at those times where we're quote unquote recycling these boxes that you realize like, wow, we are using so much cardboard, and I'm not quite sure the extent of what happens when we put our Amazon boxes into the recycling bin and how much of that actually gets recycled. But you could imagine also within those boxes there's so much other waste that comes into packaging that is definitely threatening, and definitely top of mind at times when I see something that's just completely overpackaged.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, so much of the conversation around sustainability is something that is less bad, right? It's using less plastic, it's using less cardboard, it's generating less waste, but it's still generating waste and things like that. And so it's this interesting dichotomy there. I mean, personally, when it comes to sustainability, this has been something that's been kind of a passion of mine for a while. In college, I was part of Net Impact, which is a pretty well-known college and young professional piece where you think about the triple bottom line and sustainability. My wife and I, there was a sustainability cluster that we took like 3 or 4 times where you're doing consulting projects for companies and looking at these sorts of things. And I've always been interested in these aspects of it. But you're absolutely right. I mean, I still, despite all of that, I kind of get embarrassed when I take my trash out to the curb. I'm like, wow, like, with 5 people, we're pretty pretty bad when it comes to most things.
Yeah, it's crazy. It really is, and I think part of it is that like it's not front and center really. I mean, we really only see it when we're taking out the trash or recycling, and then we're like, all right, we don't necessarily know where it goes. And a lot of people, like, I memean, I've been to the dump here, on the outskirts of Salt Lake City, and you kind of realize like, wow, we are a community that is full of trash. It's
Oh
just
yeah.
kind of shocking to see the size of our dump here.
Yeah, I think it should be mandatory for every elementary school class to go visit a dump, just to
Yeah,
like leave that in there.
totally.
So it's one of these things that like, okay, so why are we talking about By Humankind? And I think what we wanted to do with this episode was really try to highlight a company that is looking to do something different when it comes to sustainability. And they have really put a stake in the ground around single-use plastic and just what we do to consume things. And so as we'll get into it, we're going to look at a lot of different form factors and things that they've done. And it's just this really interesting piece where we all individually as consumers understand that we need things to survive, right? We there's a certain amount of plastic, there's a certain amount of waste that we're going to go through, but it doesn't have to be necessarily as bad as this. I mean, one of my good friends here works in a plastic cup company, and they have 50 truckloads a day of plastic cups that are generated that are single use for the most part. And
Wow.
they're just like, yeah, like this is, people keep buying them, right? They keep growing, they're up and to the right. And it's trash, right? It's used one time, it's cheap, it's great from that perspective, but that's really what we got. And so it's this really interesting juxtaposition where I think if you ask everybody, they will say that they care about the environment, they care about sustainability. I haven't really met anybody who says, no, I don't care about the environment. But when it comes to choices and it comes to what we can afford and lifestyle and things like that, it's not as simple. It's so difficult.
Totally. I completely agree. So I guess to start, you want to give a bit of a overview and history on kind of single-use plastic contamination and kind of how that all started?
Yeah, so it's really the thing that gets me is this is really an innovation of the last 100 years. And so the first kind of point in the story is in 1907 when there was a product called Bakelite, which is the first fully synthetic plastic derived from oil, was invented, and that's really where people point to as like the beginning of the modern plastics era. In the 1930s, 1940s, there was the development of a lot of plastics that you may have heard of, so polyethylene, polystyrene, polyvinyl chloride or PVC. And this is where Dow Chemical, DuPont, those companies were really innovating and were making some amazing strides in just what could be done with the chemistry and what we could do with plastics. In the 1940s, World War II was really an accelerant, and we saw a lot of plastics being used for military applications. And we built a really big plastic industrial complex. And once the war was over, that all shifted to consumer, because we realized that, like, hey, this is actually pretty cheap. It's pretty versatile. We can do a lot of things. And so in the 50s, you see this massive increase in single-use plastics. So things like plastic bags, straws, utensils, just other consumer products were really what was kind of the birth of that. As a side note, I don't know if you've ever seen these things on TikTok where people will excavate like an old latrine or like a site, and they'll go back and they'll find stuff like bottles and things from the 1800s. Have you seen these?
Yeah, a little bit.
I can't imagine what people are going to do 100 years from now, because we're going to have so much stuff behind. They're going to be able to see, like, everything, whereas it used to be just the glass and things like that. Anyway, so in the 1960s, you start to see plastics really become more and more prevalent, and this is really where it gets introduced into the food industry. And so we get a lot of great fresh benefits, right? You're able to get strawberries and lettuce and all these things, meat, right, wrapped up that is safer, it has less contamination, it tastes better, and so plastics really kind of come into that. In the 70s, you start to see PET, or polyethylene terephthalate, I believe is what it is. That really becomes the beginning of the plastic bottle. So Coca-Cola introduces that in, I think it was 1978. And then the 80s, you see more and more single-use products kind of being created. But then things start to change. And in 1997, there was a shipping captain, whose name was Charles Moore, and he discovered something, and that was the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And it used to be that, we had the age of exploration in the 1700s, and people used to find continents and peoples and things like that. Well, this guy found a big giant trash bag. And have you seen this thing? It's like the size of Texas or something.
Oh, it's insane. It is crazy. If you haven't seen it, Google right now, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. It is just insane.
Yeah. And it isn't that somebody went there and dumped a Texas size worth of plastic, but it's just the way the currents are. Everything kind of gets collected there from every river, stream, et cetera, that falls into the ocean. And that was really, I think, the turning point where people started to say, ooh, maybe this isn't the right thing to do. And so in the 2000s, you see a lot of awareness being raised about the environmental impact of plastics, and countries start to ban or regulate at least what can be done. So you start to see people thinking about, hey, we're going to get rid of plastic grocery bags, or we want to get rid of plastic straws. You see those sorts of things. And that was really like the 2010s, getting into the 2020s. And now there is an active focus where people are looking at, hey, can we create something that, if we know that we need plastics in our life, we can't get rid of plastics completely, but can they be from biodegradable sources? Can we solve it from that aspect of it? Are there things that can be biodigestible, or can we recycle better, or like what can we do to help solve this? Because we've seen what 80 years of unabated plastic consumption will lead to, and now we're trying to correct that trend. So I don't know if there's anything that stuck out to you, or I'm just curious your perspective of what's the right level of plastics in society. Do you think we go back to burlap sacks and nothing, or is there anything that we can do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's cool to see different companies that we all go to and use, really kind of lean into sustainability. So like, there's different grocery stores like Trader Joe's where they'll, give you a discount if you bring your own bag type of thing, which I think is really, really beneficial for society. I think in general, when I think of single-use plastics, I think of like grocery bags and plastic straws. But I will say, those paper straws were not a good innovation. I mean, if you ever have a smoothie with a paper straw, you wish you had a plastic straw then. And so I think, on one hand, I think it's a balance, right? Because it totally makes sense to bring your own, bags to a grocery store to reuse in that sense, or bring like a metal straw or something, or use a metal straw, right? I think that is great. I think, in general, I think people are always going to use like single-use cups, for example, like your neighbor that runs that cup company. I think it's that's like, I don't know how long Solo cups and that whole industry has been around, but I mean, to me, it seems like you go to a barbecue or you go to a party, whatever it may be, there's always going to be single use plastics because, you know, in my opinion, most humans are lazy and they don't want to have to wash all the plates and silverware after a barbecue. So we're always going to use, plastic knives and forks for a barbecue. So to me, I think that is a fair level of use. I don't, if someone were to tell me, hey, every meal at home, I'm using a plastic fork and knife, I'd be like, what are you doing? That's insane.
I actually know some people who did that. They were, kind of college age, and they just bought disposable stuff because, like, I don't have to do dishes. And so, your point of people being lazy, I think there's definitely a subset of people out there like, oh yeah, I'd rather look at this. And part of this too is that it's so cheap, right? And we're not necessarily accounting for all the costs because it's just being externalized. We're just looking at what it takes to produce the thing. And so we'll kind of get into this a little bit later on just government regulation, but I agree with you. I think like plastics are here to stay, but how we use them and the degree to which we're able to use them, I think probably deserves a rethink. Just to throw some more stats at you, it takes over 1,000 years for plastic to degrade, and we're not even sure that it's going to degrade in that amount of time. So just think about that. Like 1,000 years ago, there's really we have like monuments that are there, and those were giant stone buildings. That is what is left over from 1,000 years ago. Our plastic fork is going to be here 1,000 years from now. Just think about that. Like that's wild. Even when you have biodegradable plastics, if it goes into the ocean and it can very easily turn into microplastics, which are exactly what they sound like. They're little bits of microscopic pieces of plastic that get embedded in organs and cells. They contaminate fish, and it can have a lot of issues with the food chain that's there. And so it's just this really interesting thing. And you also think about this idea going back to the 1,000 years degradation, is that every piece of plastic that you've ever used in your life is still around, right? So you think about, the thing that you had when you were a toddler, the thing that you had last night, that is still around somewhere. And yeah, it's just wild. And so part of it is because it's so convenient, so cheap. And this is really something that government eventually is going to have to step in if the government decides it's something that they want to do to change behavior.
Yeah, it is. It is crazy. I think the question can be debated so much of, is life better with plastics? I think in some cases, 100% it is, but in other cases, it's really having a lasting impact on our environment in a negative way. So it's interesting to see. And I think that's really what caught the eye of By Humankind and these founders, because, on one hand, they saw the personal care industry growing pretty tremendously. And for those that don't realize like how big this industry is, I mean, globally in 2018, it was $465 billion in revenue. And, every year it's been growing by about, 5% or so, call it. So like, last year in 2023, it was 560 billion in revenue globally. The US accounted for 115 of that. So,
Wow.
Americans are spending $115 billion in the personal care industry. And most of these companies in this industry are using single-use plastics for their packaging. And so I think that's what caught the eye of By Humankind and kind of why they realized, hey, there's a lot of waste going on in this industry, and it is a massive industry. And if you look at overall consumer trends, it's really on par with their brand, right? More consumers are caring about natural and organic products. There's definitely a growing preference towards natural ingredients, clean beauty. We've touched on that in the past on different Ecommerce On Tap episodes, but there's definitely a demand increase for free, for beauty products free of toxins and personalization. Consumers want more personalization when it comes to their personal care products, and men's grooming is also a expanding part of this category. So it's interesting to see how different companies have tried to like mitigate their plastic use. Like we talked about, Bites toothpaste and what they did. But, I guess a key question would be, does recycling solve this? I mean, to me, in some sense it does, but I think what's even more unique is the way that, companies like By Humankind or like Bites have, really created this method for consumers to become more sustainable when it comes to their personal care use.
Yeah, and I think going back to some of the things that you said earlier, recycling is something that I think makes us feel good, right? Like we think that as long as I put it in the blue bin versus the black bin, that I've done my part and that's going to be taken care of. But as I'm sure many people know, not all plastics can be recycled, and in fact, most plastics are not being recycled. It used to be something where a lot of that plastic waste was packaged up in containers and sent back to China. And they went through the painstaking sortation process and figured those things out. Well, a few years ago, China locked that down and said, hey, we don't literally want your trash anymore. And so it's caused this issue where that there was really no market for recycled plastic anymore. And it's still so cheap for virgin plastic compared to recycled plastic. And so the economics are all upside down right now. And as a result, most of the stuff that you recycle, especially if it's not sorted, it's not clean, just goes in with the trash as well. And so it's this weird thing where I think people think that they're doing more than maybe they actually are, just given the nature of the economics and things that are out there. And so it really kind of begs this question of how do you change your consumption patterns to begin with, as opposed to what do you do with it post-consumption?
Yeah, it is. It is super interesting to think about. Well, let's dive into the kind of founder history of By Humankind. I mean, so By Humankind was founded by Brian Bushell and Joshua Goodman. And Brian is the son of a mother that was a substitute teacher, and his father manufactured kitchen sponges. Growing up, he had those kind of classic odd jobs that most of us have as children: a babysitter, mowing lawns, candy station. And so, yeah, I think the candy station part stood out to me a bit because for me, I remember, I would sell like those Live Strong wristbands on the side. And I think a lot of entrepreneurs kind of have a young side hustle of selling candy or something. And so that was pretty neat. But he was considered the class clown. But he attended Syracuse University from 2000 to 2003. And he got a triple major in marketing, finance, and psychology.
Yeah.
And so what was pretty fascinating was that while he was studying, he started a memory foam company, which I think is a really unique aspect of it because, not too many people really start real companies in college, right? And so he spent 3 years running this memory foam factory, and the business started while he was in college. I mean, I don't know if we've covered a founder on Ecommerce On Tap that like really started a business while in college and continued to run it after college.
I don't know. It's a pretty. Brian's a very interesting guy. We'll see that for a few different things that come out.
So he did that for about 3 years. Then he became the managing partner of Musebox Media, which is a creative agency that he founded. And then after that, he co-founded and became the CEO of Baked by Melissa, which is this incredible story where when his sister Melissa got fired, Brian gave her the idea to start her own company. And, they kind of together built this company brick by brick. And it now has more than 300 employees by the time he left 15 stores, a big e-commerce presence, their own factory. And it's just a pretty incredible success story for him. But as they got to this scale, Brian decided to fire himself as CEO because the company he thought had outgrown him. And so it was just interesting to see this, dynamic of starting this previous company with his sister before he goes on to co-found and lead By Humankind.
And to be clear, I think Baked by Melissa is doing something like north of $100 million today. And so, like, wow.
Yeah, it's an incredible sibling success story. I mean, Baked by Melissa, Google it if you haven't, seen their cupcakes before. It's pretty incredible, and they look really good online. I'm like, I need to order some.
We're just going to profile them just so we can try it.
Yeah. Next time on Ecommerce On Tap. And then his co-founder, Joshua Goodman. So he got his BA in political science from Vassar College. And he spent 3 years as a marketing manager for the Democratic National Committee and on Obama's campaign. Then he spent 3 years at Bonobos as a marketing manager, a year as a digital marketing director at Outdoor Voices, 2 years as the VP of marketing at Koyo, and 3 years of the chief marketing officer now of By Humankind, and he also is a co-founder. But as we'll touch on, he left in 2021. So Joshua is now working as a fractional CMO and consultant. But it's pretty interesting because it seems like, these co-founders are very different in some sense. Joshua obviously has a very strong marketing background. I mean, what stood out to you in this co-founder dynamic?
Well, I think that Brian just seems like somebody that I would like to just have a conversation with at some point, because it seems like he's never had a job, right? Never worked for someone else, and he's been pretty successful. And so, the idea that I think that in entrepreneurship, you never fail; you always fail forward. And so, I'm sure that there were things from the memory foam factory that he learned and said, "Oh, I do that differently." That he parlayed into Musebach, which he parlayed into Baked by Melissa. And so I just would love to hear that story of what were the lessons that he learned that took from one company into the other. And then, why even start another business? I mean, I'm sure he was doing pretty well, and could have still hired a CEO at Baked by Melissa and could have had a softer job. But, as we'll get into just, I think this founding story of why he wanted to dig into plastic was something that really stuck out to me.
Yeah. I mean, so he had the idea for By Humankind because when he quit his job as the CEO of Baked by Melissa, he took some time off, went to Asia, and while he was there, he was on a scuba diving trip. And while he was supposed to be in this like natural paradise, untouched by humankind, when he was diving, it looked like a garbage truck had just dumped all its contents in this nice, clean water. And it was his kind of first real life encounter with this single use plastic crisis. And it had a really, I think lasting impact on him because, this was kind of his unlock for seeing the problem that these single use plastics cause. And, that's really kind of where I think By Humankind stems from is that experience of realizing, wow, there's so much single use plastic waste that stems a lot of times from personal care products. And I guess, Aaron, you had a kind of similar experience with plastic, right?
Yeah, I'm not good enough to scuba dive, but a number of years ago, my wife and I were in Indonesia. We were in Bali and decided to spend some time in Gili Trawangan, which is this little, I don't know if you've ever been there. It's a little beautiful island just off the coast of Bali. So Bali's beautiful. Gili is where people go to see something even more beautiful. And so it's a small island still being developed. And on the outside of the island, you can walk all the way around it. It's maybe a mile and a half walk all the way around. And it is beautiful. It's stunning. The beaches are well manicured. There's restaurants, there's hotels. It's just awesome. And they encourage you to walk around the outside. Well, the locals don't do that, right? Because you need to get from one side to the other, you just cut across. And so there are these trails that you go through. And as you go from the water toward the center, it starts to get rougher and rougher and rougher until you get to a giant pile of trash, a giant pile of plastic that they're kind of just burning and trying to deal with because there isn't this whole lot of infrastructure on Gili Trawangan. And it's one of these things where people are bringing in their plastic water bottles. They want their cutlery. They want, all the stuff that comes, the plastic that goes in the food waste. And so it was this really kind of jarring experience that I had where, here we are on this tropical paradise. We're there because of the nature. We're there because we want to kind of see this thing. But it was kind of all for show. And in the middle, you had this giant pile of trash that they're just trying to burn to keep down because there's just so much stuff from all these other visitors that's being generated. And so you don't expect that, right? You expect here in the United States, your trash is taken away in a box that you don't have to look at, by a truck you don't have to see, and it's taken 20, 50 miles away and dumped so you don't have to see it again. But here on this small ecosystem, on this small island, there was no place for it to go, and so they had to deal with it.
Yeah, that's pretty crazy, and very similar to Brian's story. So Brian, started to research the single-use plastic problem and realized that a lot of this stemmed from products we use every day. And so kind of the foundational question here for him was like, what if I could create, a personal care product with clean formulas and put them inside containers that were reusable and clean? And so that's kind of where By Humankind was derived from. But Brian had no, real experience or background in beauty or cosmetics or chemistry. And so he started by reaching out to expert chemists to help him explore this idea kind of as a personal challenge to see, can this be done? And the mission of By Humankind is really to eliminate single-use plastic. And so their first three products were, number one, a deodorant. They patented a system using paper pods that they could recharge your deodorant. So instead of sending a new deodorant canister every time, they kind of just use a paper pod that you replace into the deodorant canister, which is pretty neat. And it's all natural, chemical free. It's a really highly reviewed deodorant. And they worked on this product for 11 months doing different tests. And once they found the formula that he knew would be able to kind of turn into a company, the chemist actually became the first member of By Humankind. And so all the ingredients, are naturally sourced and safe. And Brian, to kind of justify and showcase this, he has eaten the deodorant many times just to show that it was safe. So, I mean, there's been some other examples of other founders kind of in a similar manner eating their products that weren't necessarily made to be eaten. What examples came to mind during your research, Aaron?
Well, there's two that I've seen just personally that I thought of. The first one was when I was working with the farmer's dog. They make human grade fresh frozen dog food, and I remember we had a lunch where they made stuff out of the dog food, and it was actually pretty good. They have it's turkey and vegetables and all those sorts of things, and it has no seasoning, so you want to add stuff in there. But I remember I think it was the CTO was just like, oh yeah, sometimes if I haven't been to the store, I just take some of my dog's dog food and I'll make I'll cook that in and make spaghetti or something out of it. So that was one where they definitely put their money where their mouth was. And the other one is, I don't know if you've met Craig Dubinsky, I think is his name. He's the founder of Hello Products, which sold to I think Colgate. But he is like renowned for just taking an entire tube of toothpaste and eating it. And toothpaste is inherently something that you use and then you spit out because it's not good for you to eat. Well, their products are such that they were good to eat, or they were safe to eat. I don't know if they're necessarily good to eat, but he would sit there and just be on stage and just down a whole tube of toothpaste and be like, yep, it's safe.
That's crazy. Yeah, it's pretty nuts. But I mean, hey, I guess it's a good way to prove that this is ethically made and free of chemicals. And I think, so By Humankind, for example, like their shampoo bars, instead of using bottles like most of our shampoo bars come in, it's actually a shampoo bar. So kind of like you can think of it like a bar of soap. And they use a cold press process that takes about 5 weeks for them to make it. And Brian says that, quote, our shampoo bars last longer than other bars of the same size. And this is both due to the high density, because their formulas have a high proportion of natural active ingredients. So, it's a pretty amazing product. And they also offer mouthwash that's, in a pill form, kind of, I guess, in competition with Bite. I don't think they originally started with this mouthwash pill, but, I know, at least for me, I first saw that when Bite kind of went viral with that. So it kind of seems like By Humankind has this like fundamental rethinking of basic form factors. I mean, what kind of like risks do you think there are with this type of product development, right? Because number one, most people are not used to a shampoo bar or a kind of pill shaped toothpaste, if you will. So there's inherent risk there too, I feel like, from a kind of product development and product adoption standpoint.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you have to educate your consumer. If you are in the store and you're looking for shampoo, you're probably looking for a certain sized, shaped plastic bottle. The key thing here is that there's a different ways that you signal to the consumer of what you have and what you're selling. And so when you're putting that on notice, you're saying, okay, we're no longer using a bottle at all. We're thinking it's a bar. Well, you've got to have some really good education to say, hey, this is actually shampoo. This is not soap, right? We didn't just misplace this on the shelf. And so there's a big piece here where people just expect, a ketchup bottle to be the size, the ketchup bottle. You have all these things that you're just kind of queuing off of. But I think the fundamental thing is that people want products that work. And the perception is that if it helps the planet, that's great. And that could be a way that single-use plastics are eliminated, but the products have to work and they have to be awesome first. And the kind of one of the things that the By Humankind team looked at was they said that, people shouldn't have to give up using the products they're using. They should be able to just choose different products in a different form factor, and that's how they can reduce their single plastic consumption. And so that was really their focus, and they started with their morning routine. And they estimate that in just 1 year, if a person uses their products for their morning routine, they'd eliminate about 5 pounds of plastic just in their first 3 products. So the mouthwash, the shampoo, and the toothpaste. And they have a community, and over 13 months, they calculate that community saved about 11,000 pounds going into the environment. So that's a lot, right? I mean, 5 pounds is okay, yeah, that's big, but 11,000 pounds of plastic is pretty enormous. And so their strategy was really around like, how do you do refills, how do you do those sorts of things. And so, yeah, it was just an interesting piece here where the form factor is important, but their piece here was that they were willing to take that extra step of educating the consumer about what this product is, because they wanted them to still be able to use the products they had come accustomed to. This wasn't about going without, it was doing something different.
Yeah. I mean, Brian seemed to have a ton of ambition here by not only solving a huge problem where others have kind of just dabbled, but also in building a brand. And to do so, he knew he needed to build a team. And so, when he was starting, he knew he would need a partner, because he was aware of course, his strengths, and also looked at his weaknesses. And he says, teams with co-founders are more likely to succeed. So he actually, really took a different approach to finding a co-founder than most. So he made a list of personality traits and skills that he would need in a co-founder. And he actually began cold messaging interesting profiles on LinkedIn, looking for, brands and expertise that he admired. He then met over 100 people, had coffee with some of them, and that's how he found Joshua Goodman. And so, I mean, to me, that is a very different and unique way of finding a co-founder. I'm not quite sure if I would kind of, scavenge LinkedIn for those traits, but at the same time, it is a good approach. And I guess I'm curious, what are your thoughts when you hear that story of how Brian found his co-founder, Joshua?
I actually kind of love it. I mean, it was this idea of like, I'm being intentional. I think that everybody would recommend that the best sort of thing is to work with a co-founder that you already have a pre-existing relationship with. But if your network doesn't have someone who fits exactly what you need to do, then you do need to go find somewhere else. And it's just, I mean, let's just talk a little bit about how hard it is to find co-founders, because it's not about just, is the skill set there? It's also, how do you deal with conflict? How do you deal with decision making? How do you, what's the kind of potential that you're looking for? Like, how's this worth your time versus the other things you can do? And it's been really hard. And I think that, most of my businesses, I haven't had a co-founder. I wish I did. But it's hard to find someone who is as engaged and thinking about things and is equally yoked as you are, because it can get very, very lonely. And so, I don't know, like, what do you recommend as far as how to find a co-founder?
Yeah, I mean, I think in my opinion, definitely having some sort of mutual connection, either through a friend or, past coworker is a huge plus. I mean, there are different founder networks that I've explored through like Y Combinator. They have kind of like a co-founder matching type of community, which is kind of neat. But I mean, yeah, I think to just co-found a company with someone you don't have some sort of history or pre-existing relationship with is very risky, and definitely something that everyone should keep in mind if they're looking for a co-founder is, am I going to commit to building a company that typically takes 10 years to build with someone that I quote unquote just met, right? So and then this is something that we'll see in the By Humankind story, right? Because so By Humankind, I guess it was founded in 2018, but as we'll soon learn, Joshua Goodman leaves the company in 2021. So I'm not quite sure what the roots were for him deciding to leave, but he was only full time at the company for about just over 3 years. So a note there, right? I'm not saying something came up or whatever it may be, but just a note there. I think when it comes to finding co-founders, that in my opinion, it is best to have a pre-existing relationship with that person.
Yeah, I agree. Right. So when we think about just CPG companies in general, a lot of the majors, so your Unilevers, your Colgates, your Procter and Gambles, they have enormous marketing and brand value. And so one of the issues that any CPG company is going to have is how do you penetrate these categories? And so we talked earlier about kind of the lessons that Brian had learned from one business and parlay that into another one. He said there were a few things that he learned from Baked by Melissa that he brought into By Humankind. The first one was how important it was to get attention. And you have to have an interesting product in order to penetrate people's consideration. So with his marketing strategy, their perspective was, let's have a very striking visual presence. Let's make sure that we look to make an emotional connection with our products. And when possible, he would emphasize video over images. And he wanted people to be led by these inspiring people to be kind of part of that solution. And so I guess the third pillar they looked at was just the importance of keeping messaging consistent across things. So you have to make sure that when people are buying something from Baked by Melissa or By Humankind, it needs to have the same brand promise as you go through there. And so it's interesting of how he's parlaying one from the other.
Yeah, yeah, it is. I mean, I think that's, key for any founder that's had a previous experience starting and growing a company to obviously parlay those learnings into the next one. And I mean, it's pretty interesting to see the company right now, right? So the company has a few key employees. Online on their LinkedIn, it shows less than 10 employees. So By Humankind, just by employee count is not huge, not, nearly as big as Baked by Melissa, but it is growing. They sell, across so many different categories right now. And if you go on their website, what really stuck out to me is they try to bundle things, right? So bundling, for those in e-commerce know that it increases AOV, average order value. And so if you go through on their website, they actually do a really good job of kind of trying to, steer a consumer towards a more bundled offer to increase their AOV. So, most people I'd assume aren't just buying, one deodorant or one, mouthwash. They're kind of buying a morning bundle, if you will, which I think is a good approach by the company. Their milestones, in our research, we weren't really able to find too much about their revenue and kind of their growth, but they were founded in 2018. They had a seed round with one investor for an undisclosed sum. So in 2019, they had a more official seed round led by 8 investors for $4 million by Lair Hippo, and they launched their first products. And then they later raised an additional VC round for $1.5 million. 2021, Brian's co-founder Joshua Goodman leaves the company, and they raise a bit more funding of $1.65 million. So, I mean, it's never good when a co-founder leaves. I mean, do you think it was more because of the culture, the company's growth? Why do you think Joshua left?
Yeah, I don't necessarily want to speculate on, it was probably a very personal decision for both Brian and for Joshua. I mean, the reality is that he didn't leave for another job. He's a consultant. He's a fractional CMO today. And so it could have been just a lifestyle. It could have been a conflict that arose. It could have been, maybe the company wasn't growing as fast as he thought, or, maybe it was something where, it's just there's just some sort of difficulty came in that they made the calculation that they were better off kind of parting ways as opposed to continuing together. But I think the big thing is just, especially with a company as small headcount wise as By Humankind is, whenever somebody leaves a company, that changes the inherent culture, right? Like when someone comes into a company, they bring a piece of who they are and leave them behind. And then when they leave, they take a piece of the company with them. And it's always different whenever you have some sort of turnover. I think that's even more magnified when you have a co-founder that leaves, because this is meant to be, a foundational person. They're a founder, as in foundation. And so when you are losing something that you basically thought was going to be there till the end, it can be very difficult, and not every company survives that.
Totally. Yeah, that's a really, really good point. Do you want to talk about their supply chain a bit?
Yeah, I think that, the interesting thing about By Humankind and the reason that we wanted to profile them was because they are a business, but it's almost as if they are trying to make a statement about single-use plastics, and in much the same way making the stake in the ground. I think about, my time at Unilever, and Unilever won awards for their sustainable living plan and for all of the good things that they were doing, which they are doing many great things. And when you have something at that scale, moving it from, 10% recycled plastic to 80% recycled plastic, that has a big impact on the global economy and just how things are done. So there is a space for big companies. But at the same time, what By Humankind and others are doing is they're saying, that's nice that you're doing that. That's not good enough, right? We need to put a stake in the ground, and we need you guys to figure out other ways here. So we're going to go after the early adopters. We're going to try to prove that there is demand here, in the hopes that hopefully you buy us, or realistically you look to see what you can replicate and start pushing things forward that way. And so for them, they are currently only a D2C brand. They offer one-time purchases or subscriptions. And as you talked about, these subscriptions or these bundles are really the key for what they need to do. They are going to need to get into retail if they have any hope of being a large CPG company. If for nothing more than cost. There aren't that many people that can afford a $66 morning routine kit when you've got $1 mouthwash at the dollar store, right? So you've got to think about all those sorts of things. But what was really interesting from their supply chain is the innovation they did with their products. So they focused on making things that were very durable, things that had good materials, and they wanted it to be beautiful, of course, but they needed to use those more premium products so that their mechanisms could be refilled. And so some of those products actually they built are actually compostable, which I think is an interesting piece. And they targeted this to say, all right, we want to go into the EU, we want to make sure this is there. But despite all of this work on sustainability and things like that, I think you probably think, at least I did, that if it's sustainable, it's probably coming from Vermont, right? Or that's where they're making it. But in reality, all of this is coming from China. And their wood, their cotton, their machinery, the packaging, everything's coming from there. And so it's just this really interesting piece that they're doing. And I just want to give a shout out to friends of the show and friends of ISBA and Sourcify. Doris Dev, which is a product development company, actually were the ones that partnered with By Humankind to develop all this stuff. And so, yeah, it's just a really interesting piece here of kind of what they did to go out and make something unique.
Yeah. I mean, I think their innovation was definitely in the packaging. Like you said, I was a bit surprised that a lot of their materials and packaging is coming from China. But it looks like all their ingredients are naturally derived, and they use all clean ingredients as well. And they try to ship their products in a sustainable manner as well. So they use recycled paper parcel that kind of feels like a cardstock paper, and they really try to cut out any unnecessary packaging, tissue paper in their packages as well. So yeah, I mean, I think overall, they're continuing to grow and making strong strides towards that. But I mean, from an exit opportunity standpoint, I think it's like too early to tell right now. But we have seen this sustainability messaging resonate with consumers at scale, and I mean, I guess I'm curious, where do you think By Humankind ends up?
Well, I think that in some ways this is a statement business. And what I mean by that is that they are intentionally showing people that there is a different way to do things. And that if you are interested in radical change in this particular issue, there are options there. And so I think the most important thing that By Humankind can do to help further this mission is to simply exist. And that doesn't mean that they don't, grow and do things, but I think that this is going to be a long game. So they need to be profitable. They need to be somewhat conservative in how they're growing and how they're doing those sorts of things, because they are pushing the envelope, right? They're doing something that the world may not be ready for, but in much the same way as seventh generation goes, if we're successful, if they're successful, eventually people will look to this and be like, yes, this is how it is. And so they need to exist. They need to continue to educate people, and they need to continue to grow and be profitable, because eventually there'll be enough people that care about this that it'll start to change the pendulum. And then once that happens, it may not be a great outcome for their business, because but it could be something that changes the way that all these other big CPG companies focus on things. And so, to your initial question of what do you think sustainability messaging is, does that really resonate with people or not? I think it does, but I think that it is really something where people are trying to figure out what it means to them, and they want to be able to make those choices. And some people, in some cases, may be willing to pay more to do something, and some people won't. They need to have that choice. But I think that it's something where it's never quite done. It's never quite there. And so, By Humankind, hopefully in 10 or 15 years is still around, but they're not going to be known as the single-use plastic killer, right? They're going to be known as a CPG company that, oh yes, of course, everybody else doesn't use plastic, single-use plastic as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think this was a really unique take on e-commerce on tap, right? To focus on a company that's really trying to cut waste and make us, more aware of this single-use plastic problem in the world. And so I'm glad we covered By Humankind, and I appreciate everyone listening to e-commerce on tap. I'm curious too, if you go to the By Humankind website, take a screenshot, let us know what you think of kind of their bundled offers. I thought it was a really unique take on how they design their website as well. So curious to hear everyone's thoughts on that. And, let Aaron and I know what you think we should cover next on e-commerce on tap on LinkedIn or Twitter. Both of us are active on there, and leave us a review. We greatly appreciate it. And thank you again for listening in to this episode of e-commerce on tap, brought to you by Source Finance.